One. Hello, everybody. Welcome to AMAZE Live. It's been a couple weeks since we've done one of these, so we're excited to be back. And I'm so delighted to be joined by Educator Wendy Sellers. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Christine. How are you?
Good. How are you? I'm so excited to be here. And you have this perfect, pretty backdrop there. I don't know what that's all about, but it looks great.
Well, I had a wall in my office and I decided to paint it, and I wanted a vibrant, energizing color. So I'm glad you like it.
I love it. That's awesome. I have another room in my house that's like bright yellow on one wall, and I think that energy is a good thing. So I'm really excited to talk to you. You are what some people have called the puberty lady, and you're an educator. And sex ed educators are like my heroes in life. So I'm just delighted to talk to you. And I was wondering if we could actually start with you telling a little bit about your path to becoming an educator.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on and having this chat. I think it's important that those of us who think sex educators are heroes do have opportunities to talk to others. So thank you for that. I'm a registered nurse, and when I was growing up, I had a really pretty terrible sex education. And so I went to nursing school. I learned a lot. I was taking care of patients in the hospital, and I realized that they did not know anything about their bodies or how to take care of them. And then they ended up in the hospital and needed to be sort of fixed. And so I decided I needed to focus on meeting people upstream a little further and helping them to stay healthy. And so I went into health education consulting. And at the same time, I started having my own kids, and I wanted them to have a better sex education than I had. And I believe that that includes a great sex education at home with family and a great sex education at school with other trusted adults and peers. And so they went to school, and their school wasn't teaching any sex education. And so I volunteered to teach the lessons for the school before my kids got to those grades. At that time, it was 5th grade when it started. And I thought, well, I will teach these lessons and the teachers will see me modeling this, and then they'll take on the responsibility of teaching by the time my children reach 5th grade. That didn't happen. And so I ended up teaching not only the students in years ahead of my children, but also my children and all their friends. And that's how I got the name, the Puberty Lady.
Okay, so hold on. So how did your kids feel about this?
As you can imagine, they had many mixed feelings about it. They were a little embarrassed because their friends would say, oh, your mom's the puberty lady, you know, and on the other hand, I think they sort of had this little sense of pride and esteem that their friends were getting all this great information from their mom, and that their friends' parents didn't necessarily provide that kind of information for them. And it was of great interest and relevance, of course. And so there were definitely mixed feelings. Funny story, my children's friends grew up, got married, and one of them, I got lots of invitations to weddings, and one of them introduced me to his new bride as the woman who taught him everything he knows about sex.
I love it. I think that should be on your resume or something. I think that's amazing.
Yes.
I just want to take a second as I'm seeing people coming into the broadcast. Wendy, I don't know if you've done one of these before, but some people actually watch live and then others come later. So if you're here right now or joining us later, please feel free to drop a comment or a question for Wendy. She is the expert. So if something's on your mind, let us know. Or if you're coming to it later, drop your comments or your questions in the comment box and we'll get back to them. Okay, so that is amazing. I have a 14-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I'm not a formal educator. I work with AMAZE, but I'm not in your space. And I'm the running joke with my 14-year-old and her friends is I'm like, hey, does anybody need a trusted adult? I'll be your trusted adult. And I've been going like #trusted adult, and they're both, I think they're like your kids. I think they're both a little horrified and also a little entertained by the whole thing.
Absolutely, and good for you, because kids do need trusted adults, and the research shows that when young people have a trusted adult, either a parent or someone like you who's willing to be honest and supportive for them, that actually protects them from engaging in risk behaviors. So good for you. You are doing your part to help young people.
I told you, sex ed educators are my heroes, and in my next life, I kind of want to come back as one. But anyway, so obviously there's a lot in the news right now. And so I was really interested to talk to you. I know you have all sorts of curriculum and stuff, and I'm going to link up your website afterwards so people can find out about all the amazing stuff that you do. But, you know, what I've been hearing from a lot of parents about is how to talk to kids about what's going on, about sexual harassment, about consent, especially for kids who are younger, because, you know, at AMAZE, we're often talking about how it's important to have these conversations early and often, but it can feel really hard to do that. So, you know, I would love to hear some of your thoughts about using some of these headlines as a teachable moment, and, you know, how one, you know, so maybe like one of your top tips for how to get started with that.
Yes, great. The headlines are creating a lot of teachable moments that we can use to create discussions with our children. And the challenge is figuring out how to do that in an age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate way. And the parents that I talk to and hear from are really wanting to have meaningful conversations with their kids about sex and about the headlines, about harassment. And don't really know how, because most adults didn't have good models. Their own parents probably didn't do a real good job. And oftentimes we try to replicate what our own parents did when we parent children. So in the absence of having those kinds of models, and with the headlines that we're seeing right now, parents are a little anxious, and I think that's real normal. So I like to remind parents that children are just like mechanics. They just want to know how things work. And so to keep any explanation or discussion at a very simple, short level, and then their children can always ask for more information if they want it. So for example, one good way to start is right from the time of birth by using proper terms for body parts and not teaching kids euphemisms or cutesy names for body parts, because the mere fact that we give nicknames to body parts is, in a way, part of shaming and the stigma around talking about our reproductive systems and bodies. But it's also can be a very disrespectful way to refer to body parts, and that can carry on into relationships later.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. And you know, actually later on today, I want to share a really fascinating CNN article that showed some examples of like ways to talk to 8 to 9-year-olds about consent. But could you give some examples of like language or situations? Like what would be for a young kid, what would be an example where you could bring in a conversation about consent into something that's happening in their daily lives?
Sure. So let's say you're traveling down the road and the radio's on and there's a headline about the Kavanaugh hearing or some other #MeToo event that's going on right now. You can simply say, have you heard about this news piece before? And it's related to people not treating each other with respect. And that's one form of that is called sexual harassment. And so I'd really like to talk to you a little bit about that. And then you can talk about consent. First of all, is asking for permission before either borrowing a possession or getting into someone's body space. You don't even have to talk about sex. It's really about learning how to build respectful relationships. So I would start with younger kids with possessions. I mean, I have 8 grandchildren ages 9 on down. And so I've been seeing a lot of things about not respecting possessions, just like all children. So simply teaching them that if you have a possession and someone wanted to use that possession, what would you like them to do? Well, of course, you would like them to ask first. And if you want to borrow someone's toy or a pencil or art supply, what would you do before you just grabbed it? And of course, you would ask first. So that's called consent. You ask for consent, and then the other person can either say yes or no, and that's called giving consent or not giving consent. So it has nothing to do with sex at first.
I love that example because isn't all of childhood about consent around like stuff?
Yes.
So I think that is perfect. I think another one that comes to mind too, just because I have my two kids, my older one is very affectionate and my second one was very withholding as a child and like as a very little like toddler. And so we realized pretty early she didn't really want to hug everybody. And so we would say, and my family is very huggy, and so they would find this very weird, but we'd just say, you can get a hug or a high five, either one is fine. And I think that's another form of consent, correct? Yes?
Absolutely. And that's the next layer. When children are in situations where a family member wants to hug them or kiss them or, whatever, it's really important that we always honor the child's right to their own body. So the second message after possessions would be, you have the right to your own body space that belongs to you. And if somebody gets too close or they touch you and you don't like that or want that, you can say stop or no. And if that person doesn't respect your no or your stop, you need to get away and tell a trusted adult. And turn it around also. Other people also have their own body space. And so if you want to get close to someone or touch someone, it's important to ask first so that you can see if that person wants you to get close or touch them. And if they say yes, great, you can give them a hug or tickle them or whatever. And if they say no, then you just back away and find a different way to show your affection or interest in them.
I think that's an awesome point because I feel like that actually weaves right into teaching kids to be empathetic and to pay attention and to be tuned in to what other people are feeling. So I think that's really, really a great point. I'd like to just take that a step further too. So I think a lot of parents, and I know I felt this a little bit when my Violet didn't want to hug people, there's that kind of feeling you have like, oh, other parents are going to be judging me, or
yes.
How do you, what do you say to people? Like, just get over it? Or what, do you have like some kind of framing that could help parents feel okay about helping their kids put up those boundaries?
Yes, as parents and grandparents, that can feel very awkward. And I think it's a generational thing also. Back in the day, we didn't have any choice but to get kissed and smooched by great aunt Adolpha, and we never met her before, right? So when our children do establish a boundary and don't want to be touched or kissed or hugged, I think it's great to simply say, we're teaching my child how to say yes or no and to people getting into their boundaries. And so if she doesn't or he doesn't want to be touched or hugged right now, it really isn't about you, but they just don't want that right now. And we really think that that's going to protect them now and in the future when other people want to get into their body space without their consent. And then I've had to have a talk with my own mom about this. She's a great grandma, and she thinks that all of the great grandchildren should, just rush into her arms and welcome her hugs. But they each have their own personalities, and they each have different amount of times with great grandma and may feel comfortable or not. And so having a conversation with those folks offline, just to help them understand that in this day and age of #MeToo, we want to do better by the next generation than we were taught.
I think that's that's very astute. So I'd be curious about, a lot of parents are very overwhelmed. We've talked about that. And I think there's a lot of concern about, okay, I don't have all the words, or I'm worried I'm not going to get this right or perfect or whatever. What would you say to parents to kind of help ease them into a space of comfort, or just kind of letting go and going for it with these conversations?
Absolutely. I think all of us are uncomfortable about that. And a lot of that has to do with us. We have our adult baggage and our adult experiences and history, and we are afraid we'll say the wrong thing. The good news is saying something is better than saying nothing, always. And it's not a one-shot deal. you get many, many chances to have ongoing conversations with your children about these topics, because there will be teachable moments coming up. If they don't come up, please create those moments. So I encourage parents to watch a TV show together. And if you see a situation where there's some disrespectful behavior, just pause the TV show and say, did you notice that? What did you think about that? How do you think that person felt when that happened? And just kind of chat with them about it. And then parents also have a set of values. I like to remind people that when they talk to their children and they answer their questions, kind of have in mind, what is the value that you want to emphasize at that particular moment? Most parents really want to emphasize safety and health and respect. And so if you keep thinking about what's the message I can talk about and emphasize very briefly in this moment that has to do to reinforce my messaging around safety, health, and respect, then over time and multiple conversations, it will get easier because you're focused on those values that you want your child to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it can be, I think one of the things I might have picked up from Nora Gelperin, who introduced us actually, is just that it's okay to not have the answers too. And you can say it can be a really good moment to just be like, I'm not really sure, but I'm going to look that up, or let's look that up together. Now we have a question from somebody. I'm going to pop it up for a second, but I have a feeling it might obliterate your face, in which case I'll take it down. Oh yeah, it obliterates that.
That's okay.
Tammy, thank you for writing. She writes, I'd like to role play with my 12-year-old daughter about how to enforce a boundary. She looks older than her age, and I suspect she will soon have boys who put their hands on her or even try to kiss her. I want her to have practiced how to say no and feel comfortable with attempts at minimizing her thoughts and or coercion after her boundary is not respected. So her question is, what is the best way to start this conversation and, kind of the flow of it? She also says, and this is actually my next question, something I wanted to talk to you about is, I also have a 13-year-old boy, another daughter age 10. Oh, so all this will become more important soon. So right, just to recap, because that was a lot of words, she has a 12-year-old, wants to help her, enforce boundaries, and I suspect also doesn't want to like totally freak her out. So right. What would be your recommendations to help her get started?
Well, first of all, good for you for wanting to do that. And role play is a very powerful tool. When young people role play situations, they get to practice responses and find out what works best for them. And the more they practice those responses, the more likely they are to be able to use those skills in a real crisis situation. So good for you, Mom. I suggest that you maybe create a little skit card and say, okay, here's a situation. Let's practice. What would we do in that situation? And maybe you could each do one. So create a couple of situations involving unwanted touch. And it could be something from Mom's past, but you don't need to share anything from your past. But most adult women have had incidences where they've been sexually harassed or experienced unwanted touch. And so if you're able to kind of create a situation and say, okay, you listen and tell me if what I say is clear and sounds strong and convincing. And then I'm going to ask you if there's something else I could have said or done that would make me sound stronger. And then it's going to be your turn. And so you would each take turns doing that. So the mom could model it first, saying, stop touching me that way. I don't want you to do that. Stop touching me. I will report you. Stop touching me. I'm going to tell an adult. Those kinds of statements, and then give the daughter a chance to give her feedback if she's willing to, and then let the daughter practice with a different situation.
I think that's really good. And I like the examples you shared because of actually what to say, because I think the language can just be really simple like that. I think I'm sort of a wordy person, so I tend to think of a dialogue, but I think it can just be really simple statements like that, and they can be very effective. So I think that's really good. What do you think also about the idea of, because I'm just kind of getting inside the feeling space of this mom, and do you think it's helpful to have, to talk through your kid? Okay, so what's your day like? What kind of where do you think this kind of thing would happen? Like, would you be around friends? Can you enlist friends? Is that useful to do?
Yes, it's always useful to talk to children about what their day's like, what were some highlights, what were some challenges, and is there anything that they want to talk through that's troubling them or gave them an uh-oh feeling inside. And I think it's also very valuable for the mom to have a talk with her daughter about, gosh, you're growing up, you're 12. I've noticed that you're having some changes in your appearance, and have your classmates made any comments about how mature you're getting? Because sometimes your classmates may be curious about that, especially if people haven't started developing yet and you are. And I just wonder how that's going for you.
Mm.
So just talking about if someone's developing earlier than other students, they do sometimes experience some unwanted attention, and it may help her to be able to talk about that.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. And Tammy says, skit cards with me leading via modeling. So good. Thank you. So that's awesome.
Great.
I'm so glad that was helpful. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you actually was, we've also heard a lot of concerns from parents of sons. You know, it's scary right now. It's hard. I think it's easy to think my kid would never do that. And then also easy to think, oh my gosh, maybe my kid would do that or do something unintentional. So do you have any top tips for how parents can talk to their sons in a way that doesn't like create a freak out situation? And maybe like you've done through this broadcast with some actual language to help people get that started.
Sure. I think before we talk to our sons, it's really important for parents to do a little bit of work themselves and to kind of do some reading. It's easy to Google, sexual harassment, sex role, expectations, stereotypes, and kind of do some work yourself to understand how much you already know about sexual harassment. Someone mentioned that they needed to look up something. I did some reading before I did this broadcast with you because I wanted to be sure I was current on things, and I came across a study, and I'll give you the link so you can post it. And it was a study of how aware men are about sexual harassment, and it really indicated that a lot of adult males don't recognize what sexual harassment is, and may think that all the conversation is a little bit of overkill, which to me indicates that adults need to do some work, because men and women alike have been so immersed in a culture that promotes sexism and sexual harassment and sexual assault and what some would call rape culture that we don't necessarily recognize it ourselves. So that's step one. Then step two would be to kind of do a dive into your son's world. Share some of his activities, share some of his television shows, share his video games. And with heightened awareness, look for things in that media and in his world that really illustrate sexual harassment and disrespectful relationships, especially with women or girls. Because when you take the blinders off and you're looking for those things, you will see that our sons are swimming in a pool that encourages them to be sexist, to be dominant, and to objectify girls and women. And so once you immerse yourself in your son's world and have that awareness of what you're looking for, then you can kind of stop the action and say, oh my goodness, look at that video game. Did you just earn 2 points for running over a woman? And talk about, what does that mean? What would happen if that happened in real life? And how do women feel about the fact that people playing games get points for running over them with a car? And they're likely to say things like, oh, mom, it's just pretend.
Right.
But we need to heighten their awareness and sensitivity to what is going on around them also.
I think that's amazing. That's really, really great and very helpful. So my last question, you had mentioned you're going to send me the study, but are there any particular other resources that you might recommend for these kind of conversations, or, any top just sex ed resources? That's probably too big a question, but just what comes top of mind.
Well, there are some great books out there on how to understand your sons better, specifically how how they're raised to be masculine and what society expects from them, and how to raise sons that are more aware and less likely to be the kind of man who is going to commit sexual harassment or assault. And so I'll be happy to get a book list with some of those titles so that you can post that. And then another book that I think is really interesting and kind of, I was in a workshop with Emily Nagoski, and she wrote a book called Come As You Are, and it's about female sexuality. And the reason I bring it up is because one of her points is that we often teach people that sex is a need, and sex is not a need. No one dies without it, even though maybe people think they're going to, right? It's not like air and food and water. But it is a strong drive, and it's highly rewarded by the brain. But when we teach boys that sex is a need, then we're more likely to excuse bad behavior. And she used the illustration of two people stealing. One person stole a loaf of bread because their children were starving. The other person stole jewelry from a high-end shop, but they had the money in their purse to pay for it, but they stole it anyway. Which of those two people are we more likely to excuse for stealing? The person who needed the bread to feed their children, right? So if we portray sex as a need, we're more likely to excuse men for taking what they need, and that results in sexual assault. So I just thought her book had some really interesting kind of shifts in how we view sexuality and interactions.
Wow, I've never heard that distinction. That's really, really fascinating. Well, Wendy, this has been such a pleasure. And I feel like I've learned so much. So thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really, really awesome. Is there anything that I missed or anything that you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
No, thank you. Thanks, Christine, for hosting this and for all the work you're doing. And if people have additional questions, I'd be happy to respond afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, folks, for joining us. And again, if you're coming to this broadcast later, please feel free to drop your comments for Wendy or your questions, and we'll get back to them later. Take care until next time.
Thanks. Bye.